So now we're going to be going to part 3. We're going to be working on learning about the control mechanisms that regulate blood flow and pressure in the tissues, and explain how the activities of both the cardiac, vasomotor, and respiratory centers are coordinated to control the blood flow throughout the tissues and match perfusion with the needs of those tissues, specifically for oxygen and nutrients, as well as to eliminate wastes that are building up in the active tissues. Factors that affect this perfusion are the cardiac output, peripheral resistance, and blood pressure. So how do we affect tissue perfusion? We talked about the different, basically perfusion is the flow to the tissues of the blood, right? So the things that affected blood flow that we talked about in our previous session were the length of the blood vessels, the diameter of the blood vessels, the resistance to flow, in terms of how smooth are the walls and how much surface area do we have in the walls of the vessels, and the turbulence that can occur. So all of those things can increase resistance, which makes it more difficult to get flow into those areas. So the way that we can most readily change flow in terms of what our body can do about it, especially quickly, is to change the diameter or the radius of those vessels, right? We can't change the length so much. We can't immediately get rid of the turbidity, especially if we have a little bit of atherosclerosis, but we can change the diameter because we have all those smooth muscles in the walls of many of our vessels, particularly the muscular arteries, and the veins as well have the ability to contract with the smooth muscle in their walls. So when certain areas become active, we need to be able to get more blood to them. We need to get it there at the right time. We need to get it to the right location, and we need to be able to make sure that we're not compromising the flow to other vital organs like the brain or the heart or the kidneys. So the vasomotor contractions are a way we can change the diameter. We can change the contraction or relaxation of the precapillary sphincters, which directly affects how much blood is going into a specific capillary bed. And we can direct blood in other areas. If we have restricted capillaries, sphincters in one area, we can shunt the blood somewhere else, or we can dilate those and we can pull the blood into the area where it's needed. So those precapillary sphincters become very important. We can control the cardiac output by other main regulatory processes. The autoregulation is the tissues themselves, localized changes like needs for more oxygen, or buildup of lactic acid. Those kinds of things can mediate changes in the local tissues, particularly with those capillary sphincters or precapillary sphincters. And another mechanism is neuromechanisms. The centers in the brain can respond really quickly with the sympathetic and the parasympathetic innervation, and the autonomic nervous system can be involved there. And endocrine mechanisms, which can direct more long-term and effects that last a little bit longer when we change hormone levels in the area. So that's all of those things are going to be playing into the factors that allow for tissue perfusion as is needed in the cells of the body. Okay, so at the tissue level, we have this autoregulation that can happen, and the main effectors there are these precapillary sphincters. So stimuli can either cause them to vasoconstrict or vasodilate, and the dilation is going to reduce the resistance to blood flow, and constriction is going to increase the resistance to blood flow. So vasoconstrictors that could be present would be endothelins released by damaged endothelial cells. We want to prevent blood loss, so that will cause constriction of those vasoconstrictors. Prostaglandins that are saying, hey, we got some bad stuff going on here, and so we want to constrict. We don't want blood flow to come in here and spread this problem. Thromboxins are those factors that are helping to form blood clots, so we want to stop extra blood flow into the area. We're trying to create stasis of the blood in that region. So vasoconstrictors can be some of those examples. Then we can have vasodilators, and these are the factors that promote the dilation of those precapillary sphincters and increase the blood flow into the area. And that can include lower oxygen levels, higher carbon dioxide levels, lactate, which is a metabolite that builds up in really active cells. Nitric oxide is a powerful vasodilator. High potassium levels or high hydrogen ion concentrations, chemicals released by inflammation like histamine, and elevated local temperatures. All of those things can cause vasodilation. So again, that's why heat packs are a good way to get more blood flow into an area if you're trying to do different physiotherapy modalities, etc. So homeostasis gets disrupted, though, by some of these factors changing. And that causes an inadequate local blood flow, right? So the effectors have to react. And in this case, they're going to dilate. There are the opportunities for constriction as well, like I mentioned earlier, but we're going to be talking about vasodilation because all of these stimuli are reducing blood flow and requiring more blood flow. So we're going to have sphincters that respond with increase dilation or a decrease in resistance and an increase in blood flow. And that's going to return us then to homeostasis. That's going to be restored. So the precapillary sphincters are super, super important. They don't change the cardiac output, but they change how much blood flow can enter that local tissue. And that makes profound changes in the interstitial fluid in those areas via the diffusion, filtration, and reabsorption that we talked about earlier. So if, however, those local autoregulation things are not enough, we're going to be moving on to looking at some neuro and endocrine functions that can help. Okay, so assuming that the autoregulation in the tissues didn't work out, it didn't have enough of a change to maintain homeostasis. Now we're going to move on to get out the big guns, so to speak. We're going to move on to the neuroeffectors and the endocrine effectors. So let's look first at the endocrine effectors. The kidneys are one of the main ones here, and they're going to create both the renin-angiotensin system is going to be stimulated there. We'll talk about how that affects a long-term change in the blood pressure and the tone of the blood vessels. And we are also going to secrete erythropoietin if there's inadequate oxygen supplies and inadequate pressure to the blood in the kidneys. So both of those things are going to cause long-term increases both in blood volume and blood pressure, right? If we have more red blood cells being produced, that's going to make a big difference. Renin-angiotensin also helps to increase the retention of fluids by the kidneys, so that increases the blood volume as well, which is going to increase blood pressure. And homeostasis will be hopefully maintained by changing, again, increasing the blood volume and increasing the blood pressure if they've gone down too much. So the endocrine mechanisms specifically involve more long-term changes because, like I said, it will actually change the number of red blood cells being made. It increases the amount of fluid volume that we retain at the kidneys. So there's a longer lasting effect when the kidneys are involved, and homeostasis is restored. Now, the neurosystem has a more rapid effect. Like, it's going to take the kidneys a little bit, maybe a few hours to kind of get the response coordinated, and the effect will last for days. The nervous system, on the other hand, has really instantaneous changes. So the nervous system has baroreceptors, which sense changes in pressure, and chemoreceptors that sense changes in chemistry in the blood. Those are located in areas like the aorta, the carotid sinuses in the carotid bodies that are in the vessels leading up to the brain, because we need to be able to monitor the pressure and the chemistry of the blood that's going to the brain. The aortic sensors are kind of regulating what's going on in the systemic circuit. And then we also have sensors in the atria of the heart, which is monitoring the pressure for the blood coming back to the right side of the heart. So when we activate, when these peripheral sensors sense signals, that we activate the cardiovascular centers in the medulla oblongata, the part of the brain stem. And that causes a short-term increase in blood pressure by using the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems, right? So sympathetic nervous system is going to increase the blood pressure and increase the heart rate and increase peripheral vasoconstriction. So all of those things are going to happen under the influence of the sympathetic nervous system, and that's going to increase blood pressure. So if you have a sudden drop in blood pressure, this is one of the primary ways we can affect the entire body and bring that blood pressure up quickly. It increases the cardiac output, decreases the blood flow to non-essential areas, and specifically inactive tissues, right? So it's not going to send the blood places like the digestive system. It's going to send them to the brain, it's going to send them to the heart, and it's going to bring that blood pressure back and perfusion to the vital organs. It's going to be maintained. So here we have, again, two kind of backup systems that we have if our autoregulation doesn't work: the nervous system and the endocrine system. And they have short-term effects or long-term effects, depending on how urgent the situation is. So we just talked about having those neurocenters, right? Neuromechanisms, and those are facilitated through the cardiovascular centers in the medulla oblongata. These consist of the cardiac centers and the vasomotor centers. The cardiac centers have, part of them is a cardioacceleratory center that increases the cardiac output, and then there is a counterpart, the cardioinhibitory center, which reduces the cardiac output. The vasomotor centers, on the other hand, control vasoconstriction. They are controlled via adrenergic nerves that release norepinephrine, and that stimulates the contraction of the arterial walls. And then we have vasodilation through other nerves, the cholinergic nerves, which release nitric oxide, and that is a powerful relaxer of smooth muscle, so that helps to dilate the blood vessels. The vasomotor tone is produced by kind of in concert, by making sure that we only use just enough sympathetic vasoconstriction, that we keep them toned just enough normally, rather than having them too flaccid, I guess you could say, because if there was no sympathetic innervation at all, they would be a little bit too dilated all the time. So vasotone is this idea that if we have just a little bit of stimulation from the sympathetic nervous system coming in constantly, we actually have a broader range of control. So if they were just zero stimulation or more stimulation, we wouldn't be able to dilate and constrict very much. So the normal tone is somewhere in between, with just a little bit of sympathetic innervation. And then when we want to dilate, we can stop the sympathetic innervation and use the parasympathetic innervation to really dilate things a lot. Or we can increase that sympathetic innervation and really constrict things a lot. So it gives us a little wider range of control if we have vasotone or a baseline of sympathetic innervation happening all the time. So the reflex control of the cardiovascular function is, again, facilitated by the cardiovascular centers. They monitor the arterial blood via the baroreceptors and the chemoreceptors. So here's how the baroreceptors work. We'll come back to the chemoreceptors in a bit. Baroreceptors are looking for increases in pressure, okay? And those baroreceptors are located in the aortic arch and the carotid sinuses. So if we have the heart here, and we have the aorta coming off here, you have the brachiocephalic trunk and the right coronary artery coming off, and you have the left coronary artery coming off right here. So these two arteries here have little centers in them, the carotid sinuses, which are monitoring the blood pressure as well as the chemistry in the blood at that point. Then the aorta also has some sensors, and the right atria has some sensors for pressure. So all these baroreceptors are going to be able to sense changes in the blood pressure. When the baroreceptors are stimulated because the pressure has gone up, increasing blood pressure has occurred. The effectors are the medulla oblongata and their respective centers, their cardiovascular centers, right? The cardioinhibitory centers are stimulated, which helps to slow the heart rate, which is going to slow cardiac output, right? Which brings the pressure back down. The cardiac acceleratory centers are then inhibited, and the vasomotor centers are inhibited so that we are resulting in vasodilation to bring the pressure down, because if we dilate, we're going to increase the volume, and that brings pressure down, right? Because they're inversely related. The cardiac output, when it's decreased, is also going to bring the pressure down because we don't have as much blood being forced into the system. So both decreased amounts of blood and increased volume decreases the blood pressure and restores homeostasis, brings that pressure back down. Okay. The baroreceptor reflexes are stretch receptors, okay, in those carotid sinuses and the aortic sinuses, like I mentioned earlier. The right atrium also has some. These changes in the blood pressure in the ascending aorta cause an aortic reflex, we call it, which helps to address the blood pressure in the systemic circuit. So the aortic reflex, again, is facilitated in this way. When the aortic sinuses realize the pressure's gone up, they stimulate the vasomotor, or inhibit rather the vasomotor centers, so the sympathetic innervation to the vasomotor centers goes down and vasodilation can occur, and slowing the heart rate through the cardiac inhibitory and inhibiting the cardiac acceleratory systems. So those are how that aortic reflex works. When the blood pressure rises, we want to be able to decrease the output and the peripheral volume. We want to increase the peripheral volume, When blood pressure falls, then we need to be able to do the opposite. Okay, so the atrial baroreceptors sends the pressure at the end of the circuit when they come back to the heart. And that is a special reflex called the brain bridge reflex, which responds when there's too much venous blood returning to the heart and there's a lot of stretch in the atrial walls. That also is going to stimulate these cardiac inhibitory centers and inhibit the vasomotor centers again to bring down the cardiac output and increase the vasodilation so that we don't have as much pressure on the heart. So the opposite occurring here, when the blood pressure goes down, the baroreceptors sense a decrease in the blood pressure. This is also a problem, right? We want to maintain normal blood pressure because we need to get enough perfusion to our brain, we need to get enough perfusion to our heart and other active tissues. So as the blood pressure drops, we have to respond as well. So the baroreceptors sense that there is not enough pressure. The baroreceptors then are inhibited, and this affects the medulla oblongata by stimulating the vasomotor centers. The cardiac acceleratory center is stimulated. The cardiac inhibitory center is inhibited. So double negative there. The inhibitory center is inhibited, and the vasostimulatory center is activated. So that now we have increased vasoconstriction in the vasomotor area. So smooth muscle in the vascular walls of the arteries and veins are going to be contracting and decreasing the volume, which increases the pressure, and decreasing the cardiac inhibitory stimulation and increasing the acceleratory centers is going to increase the cardiac output. So there's more blood in the system and less volume, so the pressure is going to go back up. So this is a very important mechanism for preventing fainting and other drawbacks to having sudden drops in blood pressure. So blood pressure comes back up. Okay, but chemoreceptors are the counterparts for those baroreceptors. They're located in some of the same places in the carotid bodies and in the aortic bodies. They're monitoring the chemical composition of the blood. So they monitor how much oxygen is in the blood and whether the pH is within normal range and the carbon dioxide levels are okay. The peripheral chemoreceptors are in the carotid bodies and the aortic bodies. And then we have an additional central chemoreceptors, which are just below the medulla oblongata in the brainstem. And they monitor the cerebral spinal fluid. They also control the respiratory function there, and they have to control the blood flow to the brain. So there are both peripheral and central chemoreceptors, and they are responding to the pH changes, the oxygen changes, and the carbon dioxide changes. And they have to coordinate the cardiovascular and the respiratory activities, because the respiratory activities are going to be the main way we can change the gas concentrations, right, with carbon dioxide and oxygen. So we have to be able to kind of work in concert between the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system, and those central chemoreceptors can facilitate that. So here we see the cardiovascular centers in the CNS can also change things through thought processes and elevate the blood pressure, and the cardiac stimulation and vasoconstriction can be controlled by our brains consciously as well. So that's kind of a fun piece as well. Anyway, we're not going to worry about the conscious control for the moment here. We're going to look at this diagram here. So increasing carbon dioxide levels, decreasing pH, and oxygen levels are the main chemical stimulators here. The chemoreceptors in the carotid and aortic bodies are going to, and the medulla oblongata. So the medulla oblongata, again, is the centrally mediated chemoreceptors, and then the carotid and aorta are the peripherally mediated receptors there. So then we have the chemoreceptors stimulated. So they're going to immediately affect the medulla oblongata. The respiratory centers there are stimulated. That results in the respiratory rate increase if our carbon dioxide levels are going up and our oxygen levels are going down and our pH is going down. So that's going to increase our respiratory rate. Increase respiratory rate. And that's going to bring in more oxygen and get rid of more carbon dioxide, help us get back to normal here. The cardiovascular centers, the acceleratory center is going to be stimulated, which is going to pump more blood through to the lungs. And so we're going to get more oxygenated blood into the system. And we're going to inhibit the inhibitory center, another double negative there again, so that collectively results in increased blood pressure and output cardiac output. And the vasomotor center is stimulated, and we're going to cause vasomotor constriction, which is going to shunt more blood back toward the heart and the lungs so that we can get more perfusion in the lungs and allow for more oxygenated blood to get circulated back into the body. So it's going to decrease carbon dioxide and increase oxygen levels, and the chemoreceptors are going to sense that we've come back to normal. So we have the stress as well as a factor that can affect the cardiovascular centers. It's not just stimuli that happen with chemistry and blood pressure internally. It can be thought processes, scary events. All of those sorts of things can change our moods and our emotional states, and that stimulates the cardiovascular centers and the respiratory centers. And that affects the vasomotor centers and the cardiac acceleratory or inhibitory centers. So all of these things are subject to higher order functions from the brain as well in terms of the neuroregulation. Then looking at the endocrine mechanisms for that, we have both short and long-term effects from the endocrine system. So from the adrenal medulla, we have epinephrine or norepinephrine that can be released in response to stress and the sympathetic innervation there. And that can stimulate cardiac output and peripheral constriction. Those are kind of effects that happen with stress. The antidiuretic hormone that comes from the posterior pituitary helps to elevate blood pressure as well. It reduces the water loss in the kidneys because it helps us to retain more sodium and thereby more water. So when we have a low blood volume, ADH or antidiuretic hormone really helps us to maintain the body fluids by retaining the fluid at the kidney level. So high plasma osmotic concentrations and circulating angiotensin II are all ways that the posterior pituitary picks up on the fact that our blood is getting too concentrated and we need to retain more fluids to help, with dehydration and things like that. We want to rehydrate our blood essentially, and that increases the volume and the pressure. Angiotensin II is another hormone. It's released by the kidneys, and it helps to stimulate aldosterone production, which is in the kidneys, and aldosterone helps with retaining sodium and thereby increasing volume in the kidneys. Angiotensin II is also pro-ADH or antidiuretic hormone secretion, so that increases ADH secretion, and which we just mentioned, increases blood volume. Thirst. Angiotensin II increases our thirst, so our drive to bring on more fluids, and it also affects cardiac output and peripheral constriction. So all of those mechanisms help to increase blood pressure. The other thing here is from the kidneys, and that's erythropoietin, and we're going to look at these in the slides as well, but I'm just kind of going over it here quickly. Erythropoietin is released by the kidneys, and it helps to increase the number of red blood cells that are produced. And so that is stimulated by low oxygen levels and low blood pressure as well. So when oxygen levels and pressure are too low, it helps to constrict and increase blood pressure and increase the number of red blood cells. And we're going to look at all these individually now in the diagram. So we have increasing blood pressure happening here. So that's going to stimulate the cardiac muscle cells are going to get stretched. That happens in both the atria and the ventricles. So atrial natriuretic peptide, or ANP, and BNP, which is B-type natriuretic peptide, which comes from the ventricles, is going to be released. Natriuretic peptides are those that increase the loss of sodium. So it tells our kidneys to get rid of more sodium, and when we get rid of more sodium, we get rid of more water. So this is going to increase sodium loss, increase water loss, they go together, reduce thirst, inhibit the antidiuretic hormone aldosterone and epinephrine, norepinephrine, all of those things that increase the blood volume, and peripheral vasodilation. So it says, hey, the heart's getting too much stress here. Please, ease up on us. It decreases the blood pressure and the blood volume, and we restore our normal pressures and volumes. So that's the atrial natriuretic peptide and the B-type natriuretic peptides from the ventricles. The other hormonal regulation is for the opposite problem, right? When we have decreasing blood pressure, which we think about a lot more, and we just mentioned all of these earlier, but we have the short-term effects that happen with the baroreceptors that stimulate the sympathetic activation and the release of adrenal hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine. That is going to directly affect the blood vessels, causing constriction and helping to increase the cardiac output, and that is going to help restore pressure, right? It also, we have the effects from the kidneys, the more long-term effects. That is when we release erythropoietin and renin. Okay, renin is the one that mediates the angiotensin, renin-angiotensin system. So from the kidneys, we have the erythropoietin. That increases the blood cell formation, which is going to increase blood volume. The renin that is released is going to activate angiotensin, or angiotensinogen is going to be activated. And then in the lungs, angiotensinogen, or angiotensin 1, which is activated angiotensinogen, is going to be activated in the lungs again with angiotensin, AC, converting enzyme, which is in the lungs. And that's supposed to be a C, not an E. This is a C. Okay, so ACE, or angiotensin converting enzymes in the lungs, are going to take angiotensin 1 and change it to angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 is going to directly affect the production of aldosterone. It's going to, which is antidiuretic hormone, and or ADH and aldosterone, sorry, and stimulate thirst, etc. So that's all going to work to increase blood volume at the kidney level, and also at the mediated through the central nervous system to have us increase our intake of fluids, which then increases fluids coming in through the digestive system. And then we have increased blood volume, increased blood pressure, and we're back to normal, where we want to be up here. Okay, so again, the factors that are part of the increased blood pressure would be erythropoietin, EPO from the kidneys by increasing red blood cell production, renin from the kidneys, and renin activates angiotensinogen, and then ACE in the lungs takes angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2, and then angiotensin 2 helps to stimulate the production of ADH. It helps to stimulate the production of aldosterone and increase thirst. So all of those things happen because of these original secretions from the kidneys, EPO and renin. And then at the heart level, of course, you have the sympathetic nervous system that has increased the cardiac output using epinephrine, norepinephrine, and that directly increases cardiac output. So all of these factors working together gets our blood pressure back up. So if you're dehydrated, this is going to be stimulated. If you have a sudden hemorrhage and you have a loss of blood volume, that way this whole system is going to be activated. If for some reason you're in a sauna, for example, and your heat is causing vasodilation and you get really lightheaded, then this system is going to be activated. If you are having extreme heat stroke and things like that, all of these systems are going to be activated until they're maybe exhausted. Sometimes we can overdo it, and even these systems can't get our blood pressure back up, but they would be the immediate response of the body to a drop in blood pressure.